The fire didn't announce itself with sirens or shouting. It announced itself with a smell so wrong it forced my lungs to reject the air. Burned oak, ancient corn dust, and chemical accelerant blended into something sharp and bitter that scraped the back of my throat as I stepped onto the soaked ground at 5:47 in the morning. My boots sank into mud still warm from the night's destruction, and in front of me lay what was left of the corn barn my great-grandfather built with his own hands. Its beams collapsed inward like a ribcage crushed from the inside. The metal roof had folded and twisted into shapes that looked violent even in stillness, and thin fingers of smoke still curled upward as if the fire refused to fully leave. HOA Karen burned my barn, and in doing so she crossed a line that most people never even realize exists. Fire has a sound when it's finished eating. It pops and ticks and sighs, the last breath of something that stood for decades and is now reduced to debris. I stood there listening to that sound and felt the weight of 70 years settle into my chest all at once. That barn wasn't decoration. It wasn't a structure meant to impress or offend anyone's taste. It was history nailed together by a man who came back from war with shrapnel in his leg and no patience for things that didn't last. Every beam had been cut by hand. Every joint fitted tight enough to survive Iowa winters that cracked lesser buildings apart. Now it was ash, because one woman decided it didn't belong in her view. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Most people would have panicked. Some would have screamed or collapsed or started dialing insurance companies with shaking hands. I didn't do any of that. I felt something colder take over, something precise and focused that I recognized instantly because I'd lived with it for most of my career. This wasn't shock, and it wasn't grief yet. It was the moment when a situation stops being personal pain and becomes a case. HOA. Karen didn't know it, but she had just provided motive, escalation, and felony intent in one reckless act, and she did it to someone who spent decades dismantling people exactly like her. She probably thought the fire would end the problem, that once the barn was gone, the land would lose its purpose, the pressure would ease, and I would quietly sell and disappear. People like her always believe destruction creates silence. In reality, destruction creates attention, and attention is deadly when you've been abusing power in small, deniable ways for years. Standing there in the smoke, I could already trace the path backward. Every complaint, every inspection, every threat that never quite crossed into writing, but was always implied. The fire didn't start the story. It finished the opening chapter. The sun was barely up, casting a pale gray light across the field, and firefighters moved carefully through the remains, their boots crunching over debris that had once held generations of harvests. One of them caught my eye and gave a small nod, the kind that says without words that this wasn't an accident. Accelerants leave signatures, patterns that don't belong to lightning or faulty wiring. HOA. Karen didn't just want the barn gone. She wanted it erased quickly, decisively, before anyone could intervene. That urgency told me more about her state of mind than any email ever could. I walked the perimeter slowly, letting memory overlay the ruin in front of me. I could still see my great-grandfather standing near the west wall, pipe clenched between his teeth, explaining why that corner had to be reinforced, because wind always came harder from that direction. I could hear my wife laughing years later when a raccoon got into the corn, and I spent half a night chasing it out with a flashlight and a broom. All of that was gone now, reduced to blackened fragments scattered across wet ground, and the realization settled in that this wasn't just vandalism. It was an attack, meant to break something irreplaceable. HOA. Karen had been circling this property for months. Letters about aesthetic, complaints about visibility, quiet pressure through county offices that suddenly found reasons to stop by more often than they ever had before. Each move was calculated to stay just inside the line of plausible authority, just far enough that most people would cave to avoid the hassle. When that didn't work, she escalated. People who rely on control always do. They mistake resistance for disrespect and respond with punishment instead of restraint. What she failed to understand was that resistance doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. I had been patient because there was no reason not to be. I had land older than her subdivision, protections older than her HOA, and documentation she never bothered to read. Burning the barn wasn't a power move. It was an admission that her usual tools had failed. It was desperation dressed up as confidence. As the morning wore on and the smoke thinned, neighbors began to slow their cars along the road, pretending to be curious while absorbing every detail. Some looked away quickly, afraid to be seen watching. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of shock and something close to relief. Fear keeps people quiet, but injustice done this openly cracks that fear wide enough for people to breathe again. HOA Karen had terrorized this community quietly for a long time. Now she had done something loud. I went back to my house and washed the soot from my hands, watching dark water spiral down the sink like evidence disappearing. Then I dried them, sat at my kitchen table, and opened a legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote her name and underlined it once, hard enough to tear the paper slightly. I didn't need anger to fuel what came next. I needed clarity, and the fire had given me that in abundance. HOA. Karen thought she had ended a problem. What she had really done was wake up the part of me that never forgot how to destroy a corrupt system from the inside out. HOA. Karen didn't understand where my authority came from, because she'd only ever seen power in its cheapest form, borrowed influence and cosmetic control backed by fines and fear. She saw a title on a website once, noticed the word retired next to federal judge, and assumed that meant irrelevant, defanged, safe to ignore. What she never grasped was that authority doesn't expire the way a job does. It accumulates. It hardens. It learns how systems rot and how they try to protect themselves when light is introduced. By the time I stepped away from the bench, I wasn't leaving that understanding behind. I was carrying it somewhere quieter. I didn't inherit this land because of sentiment. I inherited it because my family understood continuity. My great-grandfather, Seamus Brennan, came back from war with hands that shook only when they weren't working, and he built that barn with the same discipline he'd learned overseas. He filed permits. He registered exemptions. He locked agricultural use into county records so tightly that even decades later it would outlive zoning boards, HOAs, and whatever corporate rebranding came next. When developers came sniffing around years later, the answer was always the same. This land predated you. This land answers to different rules. Brenda never bothered to read those rules, and that laziness shaped everything that followed. I learned law the same way I learned farming, by watching what happened when people cut corners. Before I ever wore a robe, I watched local officials grease each other's palms and call it efficiency. I watched small violations snowball into institutional habits because no one wanted to be the person who stopped the machine. When I became a prosecutor, then a judge, those patterns became painfully familiar. Corruption doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It whispers. It asks for favors. It frames pressure as necessity and retaliation as enforcement. HOA Karen followed that exact script, just scaled to manicured lawns and property values instead of city budgets and contracts. When my wife got sick, all of that receded into the background. Courts feel very small when you're counting chemotherapy cycles instead of docket numbers. After she died, I didn't want a gavel or a title or even recognition. I wanted dirt under my nails and routines that didn't involve other people's lies. The farm gave me that. Mornings measured by light instead of calendars. Work that ended when the sun dropped. Silence that didn't ask me to solve anything. Brenda mistook that withdrawal for weakness, the way bullies always do when someone stops engaging. Her first contact was polite on the surface, the kind of email designed to look reasonable if it ever had to be shown to someone else. Community concerns, aesthetic impact, neighborhood harmony. I'd read thousands just like it, each one crafted to make resistance look unreasonable. I responded once, calmly, citing agricultural exemptions and county records. That should have ended it. Instead, it triggered her. People who rely on dominance don't back off when confronted with law. They escalate to see how serious the resistance really is. The escalation was methodical. A code enforcement officer suddenly needed to inspect things that hadn't changed in decades. Anonymous complaints appeared with language so similar, they might as well have been carbon copies. Conversations shifted from requests to implications, from concerns to consequences. Brenda never put anything explicitly illegal in writing because she thought that was enough. She believed intimidation lived in tone, not in evidence. She was wrong. Patterns are evidence. Pressure is evidence. And when pressure consistently flows from one source, it stops being coincidence. Authority isn't loud when it's real. It doesn't threaten. It documents. It doesn't react emotionally. It waits for the moment when reaction becomes unnecessary. I didn't confront her publicly because confrontation would have let her frame the narrative. I didn't call her out at HOA meetings because spectacle is where people like her thrive. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I watched. I kept notes. I remembered names. Every visit, every call, every quiet suggestion routed through a county office went into the same mental file I'd used my entire career. Brenda Kilpatrick thought her reach was impressive because no one had ever pushed back hard enough to test it. Contractors owed her husband favors. Officials enjoyed campaign donations. Residents were exhausted and afraid of fines they couldn't afford. That ecosystem worked because it depended on silence. My mistake, in her mind, was refusing to be silent. My real mistake, from her perspective, was knowing exactly what silence was worth and when to break it. By the time the barn burned, her authority had already overextended itself. She had leaned too hard on too many people for too long, and cracks were forming whether she noticed them or not. The fire didn't give her power. It exposed the limits of it. It turned a quiet pressure campaign into a criminal act that demanded scrutiny. She had crossed from administrative harassment into federal interest, and she did it without understanding who she'd been testing all along. When people ask later how she could have been so careless, the answer is simple. People who have never faced consequences stop believing they exist. HOA Karen believed rules were something she enforced, not something that applied to her. She believed titles insulated her from accountability. She believed my past meant nothing in her present. Authority taught me otherwise a long time ago, and as I looked back at the smoldering outline where my barn had stood, I knew she was about to learn the same lesson, the hardest way possible. HOA Karen didn't rule by accident. She ruled by architecture, a carefully stacked system of small pressures designed to feel inevitable instead of cruel. Millfield Estates looked harmless from the outside, rows of identical homes arranged like a catalog promise of safety and order. But underneath that symmetry was a governance structure engineered to concentrate power upward and diffuse blame downward. Brenda Kilpatrick sat at the center of it like a switchboard. Every rule, fine, and inspection routed through her approval, whether her name appeared on the paper or not. Residents thought they were dealing with a board. In reality, they were dealing with one woman and her appetite for control. The abuse didn't start with me. It never does. It starts with the easy targets, the people least likely to fight back because fighting costs time, money, and energy they don't have. Retirees on fixed incomes, young families already stretched thin, veterans who don't want attention, immigrants who don't trust systems that already failed them once. Brenda learned early that you don't need to win every confrontation. You just need to make resistance exhausting. A $75 fine here, a violation notice there, a follow-up inspection timed to coincide with a workday so missing it meant another penalty. Each individual action looked petty. Together, they formed a grindstone. She weaponized ambiguity, rules written vaguely enough to be interpreted however she needed them to be in the moment. Aesthetic harmony, community standards, visual compliance, phrases that sound benign until you realize they mean whatever the enforcer decides they mean that day. One resident would be fined for a basketball hoop visible after dusk. Another would be cited for a work truck parked overnight. Someone else would get a notice for flowers deemed the wrong color palette. When challenged, Brenda would smile and reference the same paragraph, confident most people wouldn't have the resources to argue interpretation in court. Her real power came from selective enforcement. She didn't punish everyone equally. She punished strategically. Homes belonging to friends, donors, or people with leverage were overlooked. Homes belonging to critics were scrutinized until violations appeared, whether they existed or not. This wasn't incompetence. It was intent. Selective enforcement creates fear because it feels unpredictable. You never know when you'll be next, and that uncertainty keeps people compliant. It's the same tactic corrupt officials use everywhere, scaled down to lawns and mailboxes. Behind the scenes, the structure was even uglier. Brenda's husband's construction company handled repairs, upgrades, and compliance corrections for the HOA, often at inflated rates approved by the same board Brenda effectively controlled. Fines funneled money into HOA accounts that paid contractors connected to her circle. Residents who couldn't afford repeated penalties quietly sold and moved, their homes often snapped up by investors who understood how the system worked and didn't rock the boat. Turnover benefited Brenda. New residents didn't know the history, only the rules as she presented them. When she turned her attention to my property, she applied the same model, just misjudged the terrain. She treated agricultural land like a misbehaving front yard. She assumed county offices would bend the same way HOA committees did. She believed pressure always escalated in her favor because it always had. What she didn't account for was that farms don't operate under the same legal gray zones she'd been exploiting. Agricultural exemptions aren't suggestions. They're shields forged after generations of abuse by developers and local authorities who tried exactly what she was attempting now. The harassment intensified after I refused to engage emotionally. Code enforcement visits became more frequent. Complaints started citing environmental concerns, noise issues, dust control, anything that sounded official enough to justify another inspection. Each visit forced county employees into uncomfortable positions, people who knew they were being used but feared the consequences of pushing back. Brenda thrived on that discomfort. She never had to say, "Do this or else," because everyone involved already understood what "or else" meant in a small county where favors travel faster than records. Her mistake was assuming that everyone shared her incentives. Some people comply because they're corrupt. Others comply because they're scared. But fear has limits, and once people realize someone is willing to absorb the cost of resistance, cracks form. Neighbors started reaching out quietly, asking questions, sharing stories they'd never put in writing. A veteran fined for flying a flag deemed politically divisive. A widow cited for hanging laundry outside. A family threatened with legal action because chalk drawings on a sidewalk were labeled unauthorized markings. Each story was small on its own. Together, they painted a picture of systemic abuse masquerading as governance. Brenda believed her authority extended outward indefinitely because no one had ever forced her to define its boundary. HOAs rely on that illusion. They function best when residents assume rules equal law and fines equal justice. The moment someone starts asking which statute supports which action, the illusion wobbles. When I began asking those questions, not publicly, but through formal requests and documentation, her responses grew sharper, less patient. She wasn't used to scrutiny. She was used to submission. The fire was the culmination of that frustration. When administrative pressure failed, she escalated to destruction, convinced that removing the object of conflict would restore her dominance. Instead, it exposed the entire structure she'd built. Arson doesn't exist in a vacuum. It drags every prior interaction into the light, every motive, every threat, every abuse that made it feel justified in her mind. What she thought was a decisive act was actually a confession written in smoke. HOA. Karen didn't just abuse power. She depended on that abuse to maintain control. The system she ran required silence, fatigue, and fear. By burning my barn, she shattered the silence, replaced fatigue with anger, and redirected fear toward herself. Structures like hers don't collapse because of one dramatic act. They collapse because that act reveals the rot holding everything together. And once people see it clearly, they stop pretending it isn't there. The moment after a crime is where arrogance usually lingers, because the person who committed it believes the damage itself is the victory. HOA Karen assumed the barn fire closed the issue, that ash meant silence, and silence meant control restored. What she never understood was that destruction creates records of its own, and records are where people like me live. While she was busy reassuring herself that no one would dare challenge her now, I was already assembling the connective tissue that would turn suspicion into proof, and proof into inevitability. The first discovery wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. It was a pattern. Accelerant residue confirmed what common sense already knew, and security footage placed vehicles where they had no legitimate reason to be at that hour. But the real value wasn't in the footage itself. It was in what it implied. Fire doesn't appear in isolation. It follows pressure, frustration, escalation. Every interaction leading up to that night suddenly mattered in a way it hadn't before. Emails that once felt merely hostile now read like premeditation. Inspection notices that seemed excessive now looked strategic. Every complaint carried intent when placed next to a burned structure. I began reconstructing the timeline with the same discipline I'd applied to complex federal cases for decades. Dates, names, agencies. Who called whom? Who authorized what? Who benefited? County logs showed unusual activity requests clustered around my property. Enforcement officers had been sent repeatedly for issues that never resulted in citations, a telltale sign of harassment rather than regulation. Anonymous complaints arrived in bursts, always following some refusal on my part to comply with HOA demands. Patterns don't lie when you stop looking at incidents and start looking at sequences. Neighbors started coming forward once they realized I wasn't retreating. Not loudly, not all at once, but in cautious waves. One would mention a fine that appeared days after disagreeing with Brenda at a meeting. Another would quietly share an email where community cooperation was framed as a warning. Someone else produced photographs of inspectors measuring grass with rulers while ignoring worse violations down the street. Each piece was small, but they fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. This wasn't overzealous management. It was targeted enforcement designed to punish dissent. The deeper I dug, the clearer the financial incentives became. HOA funds flowed toward contractors with personal ties to Brenda's household. Compliance repairs always seemed to require services offered by the same handful of companies. Residents who couldn't afford the cycle of fines and repairs sold quickly, often below market value, to buyers who never complained. Turnover stabilized Brenda's authority while erasing opposition. That wasn't governance, it was extraction. Then there were the county connections. Requests that should have died on a clerk's desk instead found their way into active enforcement. Officials who should have remained neutral were suddenly involved in disputes far outside their usual scope. I didn't need a confession to recognize misuse of authority. I'd sentenced people for less obvious patterns than this. All it took was documentation and the willingness to follow it where it led. What transformed suspicion into certainty was motive. The barn wasn't just visible, it was inconvenient. It sat on land protected from development, land that interrupted expansion plans and aesthetic control. Once I began reviewing development proposals and zoning maps, the picture sharpened. My property wasn't a random irritation. It was an obstacle. Removing the barn wasn't about beauty. It was about leverage. Destroying the structure weakened the agricultural use argument, or so Brenda believed. In her mind, fire simplified the problem. In reality, it exposed it. Witness statements started to echo one another. Different voices, same themes. Pressure, retaliation, fear. Each account reinforced the next until denial became impossible. I didn't need to persuade anyone aggressively. The facts did that on their own once arranged properly. The more evidence surfaced, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a single rogue act, but the predictable outcome of a system that rewarded abuse. HOA Karen underestimated the patience required to prove intent because she'd never needed it herself. She lived in a world where authority was immediate and consequences were theoretical. Proof operates differently. It accumulates quietly, waiting for the moment when resistance turns into exposure. By the time she sensed something was wrong, the case was already built far enough that denial would only deepen her liability. Discovery isn't about finding one perfect piece of evidence. It's about making it impossible to argue that the truth is accidental. Every document, every witness, every inconsistency added weight. And weight is what collapses structures built on intimidation. Brenda had spent years convincing people they were alone. Proof showed them they weren't. HOA Karen didn't realize the ground had shifted until she tried to stand on it and felt nothing solid underneath her feet. People like Brenda are used to controlling confrontations by choosing the setting, the timing, and the audience. She preferred closed-door meetings, email threads she could curate, and one-on-one pressure where her tone did the heavy lifting. What she wasn't prepared for was confrontation without permission, exposure without negotiation, and a collapse that happened in public where narrative control was no longer hers to dictate. The first crack showed when she called an emergency HOA meeting under the guise of addressing recent disturbances. The language was carefully chosen, vague enough to imply disorder without naming cause, but everyone knew why they were there. The burned barn had become the unspoken centerpiece of the community, and silence around it felt louder than any accusation. Residents packed the room with a tension that hadn't existed before, whispers rippling through rows of chairs as people realized this wasn't going to be another routine lecture about compliance. Fear had curdled into something sharper. Brenda walked in late, dressed impeccably, clipboard tucked under her arm like armor. Her confidence was practiced, but it wavered just enough for those who knew her well to notice. She opened with procedural language, talking about unity and cooperation, trying to steer the room back into familiar channels. It didn't work. When the floor opened for comments, hands went up immediately. Not just one or two, but dozens. People who had never spoken publicly before were suddenly standing, voices shaking at first, and then strengthening as they realized they weren't alone. Stories poured out, fines issued without explanation, inspections that followed disagreements, threats delivered through implication rather than words. Brenda tried to interrupt, to redirect, to remind everyone of decorum, but decorum loses its power when enough people decide they're done being polite. Each testimony stripped another layer off her authority, until what remained was naked control, exposed and indefensible. She wasn't the calm administrator anymore. She was the common denominator. When my turn came, the room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, expectant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid out the timeline, the documentation, the patterns that tied every incident together. I spoke plainly, not as a judge, but as someone explaining facts that refused to stay buried. I didn't accuse her directly of arson. I didn't have to. I spoke about escalation, motive, and consequence, and let the implications settle where they belonged. Brenda's composure fractured visibly. She tried to laugh it off, then pivoted to denial, then to indignation. Each shift made her look smaller, less in control. She accused me of vendetta, of using my past to intimidate her, of stirring unrest. It was the kind of defense that works only when the audience is isolated. In a room full of shared experience, it sounded hollow. People began murmuring openly, not in confusion but in recognition. They'd heard those tactics before, used on them individually. Hearing them deployed publicly stripped them of their effectiveness. The collapse accelerated when questions turned financial. Someone asked about contractor relationships. Another asked why certain violations were ignored, while others were punished. Brenda deflected, then snapped, then outright refused to answer. Refusal is a luxury of power, and the moment power evaporates, refusal looks like guilt. Phones came out. People started recording. The meeting stopped being an HOA function and became something else entirely. A reckoning unfolding in real time. By the time Brenda abruptly adjourned the meeting, the damage was irreversible. Walking out didn't restore control. It confirmed loss of it. Conversations continued in the parking lot, clusters forming where isolation used to exist. Contact information was exchanged. Stories were compared. The fear that had kept people silent was replaced by momentum, and momentum doesn't wait for permission. Brenda retreated behind lawyers and formal statements after that. But the public collapse had already done its work. Authority that relies on intimidation can't survive daylight. Every attempt she made to reassert control only drew more attention to what she was trying to hide. The confrontation didn't end her power by itself, but it broke the illusion that sustained it. And once that illusion shattered, the fall became a matter of time, not possibility. Once HOA Karen realized intimidation no longer worked, she did what every failing tyrant does when fear stops producing obedience. She reached for expertise she didn't actually understand, and tried to weaponize it faster than it could be verified. Lawyers appeared. Letters thick with legal language landed in mailboxes. Threats were repackaged as formal notices, hoping that official formatting would scare people back into line. Brenda believed that if she wrapped her retaliation in enough credentials and jargon, it would regain the authority she had just lost in public. What she didn't realize was that she had stepped into a domain where precision matters and mistakes compound brutally. Her attorneys came out swinging, issuing cease and desist letters accusing residents of defamation for speaking about their experiences. They warned of lawsuits, damages, and personal liability, the same old scare tactics delivered with a higher hourly rate. For many people, that would have been enough to shut things down. Legal threats exploit uncertainty, and Brenda counted on that uncertainty to restore silence. What she didn't account for was that I had spent decades watching exactly this strategy fail when confronted by people who knew how to respond. The retaliation escalated quickly. County offices were suddenly flooded with complaints questioning the legitimacy of the meeting, the accuracy of the claims, even the mental stability of those who spoke up. Brenda pushed hard, too hard, and that urgency left fingerprints everywhere. Officials who had previously been willing to look the other way began distancing themselves, not out of courage, but self-preservation. No one wants to be the last person standing next to a collapsing structure when investigators arrive. I responded the only way that ever works against manufactured authority, calmly, methodically, with facts. I didn't argue emotion. I didn't counter threats with threats. I clarified law, agricultural exemptions, anti-retaliation statutes, protections for whistleblowers, defamation standards that require false statements, not lived experience. Each letter Brenda's team sent out created another opportunity to demonstrate how hollow their position was. Every overreach became evidence of intent to silence rather than correct. Experts entered the picture, not because I summoned them theatrically, but because the situation demanded it. Independent auditors reviewed HOA finances. Legal scholars weighed in publicly on selective enforcement and abuse of authority. Fire investigators spoke carefully but clearly about patterns inconsistent with accidents. Each voice added weight, not volume. Brenda tried to counter with her own experts, consultants who spoke in vague assurances and avoided specifics. The contrast was obvious to anyone paying attention. Retaliation has a fatal flaw. It assumes fear still exists. By the time Brenda escalated, fear had already burned off, replaced by something far more dangerous to her position: confidence. People who had lived under pressure for years suddenly understood that the rules being used against them weren't immutable truths. They were interpretations, enforced selectively, and now exposed. Confidence spreads faster than fear ever did, and it's much harder to contain. Her final attempt to reassert control came through a formal complaint filed against me, alleging abuse of influence and harassment. It was poorly constructed, heavy on accusation and light on substance. She thought invoking my past would taint the present. Instead, it highlighted her desperation. Retaliation framed as accountability rarely survives scrutiny, especially when the target knows exactly how scrutiny works. What Brenda didn't understand was that expertise cuts both ways. Once professionals start looking closely, they don't stop at the surface. They follow threads. They ask uncomfortable questions. They document inconsistencies. Her retaliation didn't intimidate experts. It attracted them. And experts, unlike residents she once bullied quietly, don't scare easily. They write reports. They testify. They leave records that don't go away when someone loses patience. By the time the retaliation phase ended, Brenda had accomplished the opposite of what she intended. She hadn't restored order. She had widened the circle of scrutiny beyond the community and into realms she couldn't control with fines or smiles. The system she relied on had finally turned against her, not out of loyalty to justice, but because systems hate liability more than they love loyalty. And she had become a liability no one wanted to carry anymore. Victory didn't arrive with sirens or speeches or the kind of noise people expect when a tyrant falls. It arrived quietly, in envelopes stamped with official seals, in emails that stopped mid-sentence because there was no longer anyone willing to send them, in meetings that were cancelled without explanation and never rescheduled. HOA. Karen didn't lose everything in one dramatic moment. She lost it in pieces, each one small enough to deny on its own, large enough together to leave nothing standing. The first sign was absence. Brenda stopped appearing. No more surprise visits. No more clipped emails about compliance. Her name disappeared from correspondence, replaced by vague references to the board, which itself suddenly struggled to reach quorum. Contractors backed away, claiming scheduling conflicts that hadn't existed before. County officials returned calls slowly or not at all. Influence evaporates fast when it's no longer protected, and once people sense that protection is gone, they distance themselves instinctively. Formal findings followed. Not sensational, not theatrical, just decisive. Reports concluded selective enforcement. Financial irregularities were flagged for further review. Fire investigation results were forwarded to the appropriate authorities without commentary. Each document spoke in neutral language that carried enormous weight. Brenda's lawyers went quiet first, then withdrew entirely. The silence wasn't confusion, it was calculation. Residents felt the shift before it was announced. Fines stopped appearing. Violation notices were rescinded without apology. People parked their vehicles without checking the clock. Flags went up. Gardens stayed where they were planted. Ordinary life resumed in ways that felt radical only because they had been denied for so long. Fear doesn't leave all at once. It loosens, then fades when nothing bad happens afterward. The HOA restructured itself without fanfare. Emergency elections were held. Rules were rewritten in plain language. Enforcement standards were applied evenly, or not at all. Transparency replaced discretion, not out of moral awakening, but necessity. Everyone understood what had nearly happened, and how close they had come to losing more than peace. No one wanted to repeat that lesson. As for Brenda, her disappearance became permanent. She moved quietly, the way people do when they understand that attention no longer serves them. The woman who once thrived on visibility and control ended up reduced to a cautionary mention, a name people spoke less often over time, not out of forgiveness but irrelevance. Power didn't explode when it left her. It deflated. I rebuilt the barn without rushing. New beams went up where old ones had fallen, not as replicas, but continuations. The land didn't need symbolism, it needed use. I worked without ceremony, without announcements, letting the structure return to the place it had always occupied. Neighbors watched from a distance at first, then offered help without asking why it mattered. They didn't need explanations anymore. The finality of it all settled in one morning when I realized I hadn't thought about Brenda in days. No anger, no vigilance, just absence. The system she had depended on no longer bent toward her will, and without that bend, she was just another person with no leverage and no audience. That's the quiet ending power fears most. There were no lessons delivered, no warnings issued, no speeches made about justice or community. Things simply stopped being broken, and in that stillness, standing on land that had outlasted every attempt to control it, I understood something Brenda never did. Some authority survives fire. Some control does not. HOA Karen went silent.